The following video is made possible by a generous grant from the Mid-Atlantic United Methodist Foundation, providing stewardship and investment services to faith-based organizations. This is Partnering for Vital Ministries, Courageous Leadership in a Changing World, with Ted Brown and Andy Lunt.
Hi, I'm Ted Brown.
And I'm Andy Lunt. And we'd like to welcome you to Partnering for Vital Ministries, Courageous Leadership in a Changing World. In this session 6, we're going to be talking once again about culture. And a quick reminder, as we discussed last week, that culture is really important and that it eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can have the best strategies in the world, but if not reading the culture accurately, then the strategies have a much lower chance of success. So Ted and I are going to share some stories that we know as an example of some success in changing church culture. But we don't want you to get the impression that we've had nothing but successes. We've had some failures along the way, and sometimes failure is the best teacher. One particular that stands out in my mind is in a church that I served. It was a small church in South Central Pennsylvania. And I went in full of energy and enthusiasm to change the church and the world. And what I failed to recognize was that this was what would be known as a patriarchal church. There was one member who not only was very influential in the church, but in the town. He owned a local business. And I tried to do all kinds of things, all the kinds of strategies I'd learned in seminary and had had success with in other places, not realizing that nothing would happen in the church unless it had the support of the patriarch. So I learned from that experience. And not from lots of other experiences as well. But that was really a failure on my part. And that ministry lasted just 1 year. And I'm sure that the congregation held a party when my wife and I left that community. But I want to talk about one of the other stories that has a little bit more of a flavor of success. And among the stories that I've encountered in my work with congregations, the one that I know best is that of a congregation for which I was the pastor for 30 years, actually. And the church is named Glenmar. It's in central Maryland. But when we went to Glenmar, it was really a country chapel. It was built on what had been farmland, and most of the families had some link to the farms and to the stores and services that provided for the farms and the farmers. But growing up around it was a new community, the community of Columbia, Maryland. And that community was formed because a developer bought up acres and acres of farmland. And of course, the people who had been farmers, who had grown up in a rural farming community, were very resentful of the people moving in because they had taken their land and were changing the rural character. And so the first thing that we discovered was that there was a resistance to people in that new community. They represented a great mission field of people who could be introduced to the gospel and trained as disciples, but it wasn't happening because there was so much resentment in the congregation. So the first culture shift that had to happen was to open the congregation to a willingness to welcome the newcomers. And that doesn't just happen in places where new communities are growing up. It happens in a lot of churches where it's really hard for people to break in. Sometimes I know churches refer to themselves as family churches, but it's not easy to break into a family. You almost have to marry into it. And in a church, it can be really difficult to be accepted and to belong. Well, once that shift was accomplished, and that took several years, the next shift was from a small church to a larger church. And with the many people moving in around the church, that happened almost naturally, almost by accident, if you will. And so we were thriving and welcoming all those new people and having large new member groups almost every other month. But that took some getting used to because no longer could the pastor or anyone know everybody else. And then the big shift when you went from one worship service to two, helping people to come to the point where they realized that what was important, more important than their personal comfort, was the opportunity to reach more people and grow more disciples. Well, then what happened is that that was very successful. And people were coming in, many people coming in, and many people not staying in the church, because what we were doing was offering an attractional ministry, not discipling people. And so the back door was was as busy as the front door. People would stay only as long as it was convenient, or as long as their children were in school, or as long as their children got through confirmation class, and then they would move. And so the next step was to help people discover and help the pastor discover that it was really important not just to get people into the building, but to have people going into the world as disciples. And there are some helpful hints about how that can happen. And in future sessions, Ted and I will be sharing some of those. But the next step was to change the many people who were now in this fairly large church from spectators to disciples, to actually doing ministry. And that was hard, because at each step along the way, not only did the laity have to learn new ways of being and doing church, but the pastor had to do that. And this was probably the hardest for me as the pastor, was to give up many of the ministry functions that I had done as the church had grown. I had to, for instance, we had to have other people doing the visiting, the caring ministers who would visit in hospitals and pray with people, and Stephen ministry, so that there were many more people who could be reached. A lot of churches don't grow, of course, and I've said this before, because the pastor is trying to do everything, and the pastor can only reach so many people. But when you empower the laity, then far more people can be reached, and far more people can be grown as disciples. Well, after a building program that proved inadequate, the congregation then did some soul searching and decided that they needed to move to a new location. And so the congregation took a huge step of moving to a 21-acre site where they built basically a missional campus. And the greatest part of this story for me, for which I take no credit, but for which I'm deeply grateful to God and the congregation, is that this congregation saw themselves so much as a missional community that they left behind a fully paid for, beautiful sanctuary that was less than 20 years old, and moved to a missional campus at which the congregation worships to this day in what is really a gym. But that gym and the surrounding land allow the congregation to be in mission to the community in ways that were never before possible. All kinds of missional outreach, both community groups using the building and the congregation reaching out, with an annual walk to Bethlehem that attracts 3,000 people to experience the Christmas story, with an annual day of service that brings in more than 1,000 people from the surrounding community, not church members, to come in and engage in acts of service, packing over 100,000 meals, going out in the community, making beds and serving the needs of people in the community. And all that took, at each step along the way, a recognition that the culture needed to change. And here's the word for pastors. At each of those steps, the pastor had to change his or her, in this case, my personal culture. Well, that's my story, and Ted's going to share one of his stories, and from a different perspective.
Well, Andy, that's a great story. I just want to emphasize that as we go forward in this series, we're going to be talking about knowing yourself first, and then secondly, knowing the culture of the church that you're a part of and wish to be. So you just gave some really great examples of that. I too have many stories to share about culture at different churches, but I'd like to share the one that is closest to my heart, and that is at Hockessin, Delaware United Methodist Church. I was asked to lead a reorganization of the church. And as I began to dig into it, I found out that that was really just trying to deal with a symptom. The real issue were burned out leaders. We were having trouble with getting people to volunteer to serve, both in leadership roles in the church and as Sunday school teachers. We also had a lack of growth in our worship service, and actually some decline in our Sunday school program. And this was odd given the fact that we were in a growing community. And as we talked to the members of the congregation, we found out that the intent and the progress of our church was basically unknown to them. In other words, they were pretty much going through the road of attending the Sunday worship service and, and pretty much thinking that that's all church was about. So we began to talk to other churches in the community, and through study, through the interviews with the different people in the church, we began to recognize we needed to shift the culture of Hockessin United Methodist. We began to understand that the church was really reflecting a Fortune 500 company in our community. And we had fallen into the trap of reviews and the trap of judging others in their work. And so what we had to do was really begin to change the purpose of the church and change how we do it. So we ended up taking a look at our church council and realizing that we needed to shift the balance of the work from an administrative focus to a focus of servant leadership and church direction. The council had gotten into the pattern of endless ministry and committee reports, and then a conclusion of the meeting. We shifted that by having each of the committees and the ministries create a covenant with the council. The covenant basically was, here's what we intend to do, here's our purpose, here are our goals, and here are the resources we need. And that freed up our committees and our ministries to do the work that God was calling them to do in the church. And this allowed the church council to shift more towards developing their own spirituality. In fact, we devoted a third of the meeting to personal growth through study of the scriptures at each council meeting. We also changed the structure of the church. We renamed some of our ministries to proclaim the direction specified in the vision that we had for Hockessin. We realized that we all are disciples of Christ, and that leaders indeed are ministers, not just program leaders. And so we began to rename things. We talked about reaching out instead of evangelism. We talked about celebrating instead of worship. We made these name changes in order to communicate a change in what we were about and what we intended to do. Some other parts of the change were that we'd fallen into the fact that we thought, well, we had this program or this ministry, we need to have somebody backfill the person that was leaving it. And we just kept going on with things that weren't necessarily helping us in movement in the direction we wanted to go. So we re-looked at what were mandatory ministries and then said, okay, ministries beyond that need to be filled by people who are called by the Holy Spirit to witness or serve. And this brought in passion and energy that we never had before, and in some surprising areas that we had not considered. And as I mentioned before, the members of the congregation were not really aware of what we wanted to do and the direction we wanted to go. So we increased our communication by making all the ministry and committee reports available to them, just as they were to the council in advance of the council meeting. We adopted a logo of growing as disciples and made a special emphasis on small groups as a important part of that effort. And I think all of this has helped shift the culture at Hockessin, one such that today the number of people in small groups is quite high. And as well, they were able to do a capital campaign that was more than twice the annual operating budget. And they fulfilled the campaign not with pledges, but with actual cash donations. So you can see that what started out was reorganizing the church ended up being a much more in-depth view of its culture, both of the minister and the members who were fulfilling roles of leaders of ministries and committees. What we'd like you to do is do much the same thing. Take a look at the identity and purpose that you have devised with others in prayer with God, and look at the church culture survey that we asked you to do in session 5, and prepare a list of shifts that you want to make in your church, from internal focus to a balance of internal and external focus. From the pastor doing everything to many more people involved in ministry. From worship only and study of the scriptures only on Sunday to daily prayer and small groups. Those are examples of the shifts that maybe you want to do at your church. So we've included a form for filling out this from and to shift, an example of from one church that I worked with to kind of catalyze your thoughts. Once again, we'd like to thank you for listening in on this video. We're interested in your thoughts and your comments, and if you would, send those to the email address that you see on this slide. What we'd like to do is just close with a thought on leadership. This comes from Psalms chapter 78, and it really reflects that a leader's integrity comes from within. David shepherded them with an integrity of heart, and with skillful hands he led them. And our words are always listened to as laity leaders, as pastors, and they are a strong indicator of where our heart is at. So it's important that we really pay attention to it, because strong leadership will come from the integrity of our hearts. Well, once again, we'd like to thank you for watching us on this video, and God bless your work.
God bless you and your ministry. Thank you.
To access additional key resources, including homework assignments, please register for Partnering for Vital Ministries at the Foundation website shown below. You may also contact us through the website for more information about our stewardship and investment services. This has been a production of the Mid-Atlantic United Methodist Foundation.